Start பண்ணிடுங்க.
Okay, sir.
Yeah.
Thank you, delegates, for your kind cooperation. Now it's time to introduce the next speaker of the day, Dr. V. Ramamurthy, sir. Professor V. Ramamurthy, sir, is currently working as HOD of Biomedical Engineering at Sri Ramakrishna Engineering College, Coimbatore. He has completed PhD from University of Texas Medical Branch, USA in 1986, and has a work experience in various institutions like Harvard University, Cambridge, Baylor College of Medicine, Austin, and Sarbai Research Center, Baroda. Professor V. Ramamurthy, sir, has been honored with Rockefeller Foundation Biotechnology Career Fellowship from Harvard University, Cambridge in 1994, Robert Welch Fellowship in Biological Chemistry, Baylor College of Medicine, Houston, and was awarded as the best student in microbiology from University of Texas in 1986. Let us greet Dr. V. Ramamurthy, sir, who will be continuing today's session with innovations in healthcare, cost and consequences. Over to you, sir.
Thank you. So how do I get? I think there are about 39 participants.
Yeah, total 60, sir.
Okay. All right.
Yeah.
So what I thought I will do is, let me just get the sorry. Okay. Can you all see my PowerPoint slides?
Yes, sir.
Okay. So good morning to all of you. And particularly today is, International Women's Day. So I congratulate all women who are participating as professionals. So today I wanted to talk about something. I know this particular program, which goes for about a week or so, talks on various aspects of conducting research in biomedical areas. So one of the important differences or areas is since the biomedical research deals with human welfare, there are a lot of rules, restrictions, etc. Okay, unlike if you were to work with materials or things of that nature. Okay. So today I thought I will share with you a short story on innovations, particularly in healthcare. And nowadays we talk a lot about innovations in our country. But all of you know that in the field of medicine, innovations, particularly in the last maybe about a couple of centuries, have transformed the whole field of health and human welfare. Okay. So innovation is very important, and ultimately innovation plays a very important role in the health and management of sickness all over the world. Okay. But there is also a other side to innovation, which I will touch upon, so that people who are engaged in doing research become sensitized to that, and when you are planning and doing your work, this comes into your focus as well. Okay. So the topic or the story relates to an article published by Bradley Weatherheim in Smithsonian Magazine last year as a part of case study. Okay. So innovation in healthcare, costs and consequences. A short story is the title of my presentation, but really the broad question is, do healthcare professionals and engineers, because I am currently with the biomedical engineering department, a little bit of I'm trying to pitch the role of engineers in healthcare. So do they have any role to play in health? And the the specific case is bulbar polio, which happened in Copenhagen. Okay. So very shortly, the broad outline of the story is the events happened in a hospital called as Blegdam Hospital in Copenhagen around 1952 August. And the scenario was that there was a snowballing pandemic or a growing pandemic, and all of us have some experience of what a pandemic is. Okay, a lot of people getting affected, infected. The hospital systems are unable to take care of the rising number of patients, etc. And the scenario was not very different then. There were more patients than facilities to support. And as usual, the number of patients were so high that the number of staff was really not sufficient to take care of the sick people. And specifically, the case or the story revolves around a 12-year-old girl, Vivi Ebert. She was paralyzed when she was admitted to the hospital, gasping for air and drowning in her own secretions. Okay. And the hero in this particular story is, Dr. Ibsen, John Ibsen, trained as an anesthesiologist, and he was working in that hospital, Blegden Hospital at that time. And Vivian was sort of brought to his ward for him to take care of. Okay. So very briefly, a little bit about the disease and how this disease is managed. In the 1950s, polio was a big menace. And even at that time, almost everybody knew somebody who was affected by polio. Since I don't see any of you, so I would presume that most of you are too young to know many people who are affected by polio, but maybe most of you have come across one or two people who are affected by polio, mostly older generation people. Okay. And the symptoms of this disease is, of course, one gets fever, headache, then an upset stomach and a stiff neck. So basically the disease is that it starts with the gastrointestinal infection, and most of the time it is a self-limiting infection. But about 2% of the cases, the situation becomes worse, and the nervous system gets affected, and then there are a lot of consequences. And most of the polio victims you would see have gone into that scenario or that situation. Okay. And in the 1950s, even in developed countries like the US and the Europe, polio was pretty prevalent during summer months, and it was known as a summer plague. And in 1952, when this particular case happens, actually in Copenhagen, there were a lot of cases, and obviously a lot of people coming to the hospitals at that time. Okay. So as I mentioned, this particular disease, it is sort of self-limiting in, say, about 50 to 70% of the cases, but the number of infections are so large that even the small number who get into more serious effect, the neurons are affected. So if the neurons get affected, then the symptoms lead to paralysis, shock, and lastly, asphyxia, that is inability to breathe, and soon the patient dies. Okay, so it's a pretty grim situation. So roughly about 20% of people who have who are affected by whose nervous system is affected, they end up paralytic, and among the rest, I think a good number essentially develop into the rest of the symptoms, and usually death is the unglamorous outcome. Okay. So in this particular hospital, about 50 new cases were coming each day, and once the virus, this disease is caused by a virus called as the polio virus, and it was already known at that time that this virus, the disease is caused by a virus. Okay, in the 1950s, and once it infects the nervous system or the neurons, then it essentially means the disease is more of a serious nature, or the consequences are more serious nature. And bulbar polio is a case where the lower part of the brain and the spinal cord is actually infected by the virus. Okay. And hundreds of bulbar polio cases, patients were already to be seen in this hospital in Copenhagen. And people who are affected, or whose spinal region is affected by the virus, usually they have difficulty swallowing and breathing. Their heart rate is affected, the blood pressure rates are affected, and almost about 30 to 40% of the patient develop into what is called as a respiratory insufficiency, which means they have great difficulty in breathing. And once those people get into that, the prognosis is extremely bad. Almost 80% of these patients who get into respiratory insufficiency, they will die. They will die sort of comatose, attached to some kind of treatment machine, etc. Okay. And at that time, the best available medicine or treatment was what is known as iron lung or iron lung machine. And there are various stages of development of this iron lung machine. And in this particular hospital, there were really very few, one or two state-of-the-art heart lung machine. And there are also others which were not as good as what was the best available in those times. Okay. So briefly, the heart lung or the iron lung looks like this. It is basically a drum in which the patient is laid, and it has an opening, and the patient's head sort of goes out, and essentially the patient is covered in this iron drum, and vacuum is created here by a vacuum pump. Okay, so there is actually a rubber lining here, and this motor essentially creates a vacuum here, and this leads to the sort of swelling of the body, and particularly the lung, which allows the patient to or the air to move into his lung. Okay, and then the cycle of this pump is essentially this thing closes, and which means that is a greater pressure here, and the air goes out. So this sort of facilitated breathing, and this is called as the lung machine or iron lung machine, which was invented in Harvard University in 1928. Okay, by a couple of people, Dinker and Shah. Okay. So the hypothesis at that time was the cause of death. The prevailing view at that time was the brain is damaged, and that's why patients die. Okay, as I mentioned, about 80% of the patients die. And Ibsen, the anesthesiologist who was in this hospital at that time, I will talk about some of his background shortly. He was thinking that probably this is not the reason why the people die or the patients die, is not because the brain is too damaged for survival. Okay, he was thinking more in terms of the lung is not working, and essentially if you can help the lung to work, essentially to help the individual to take in air or oxygen, and if we can sustain the working of the lung with some kind of external support, the patient can be actually saved. Okay, and the reason the people who are in this condition is because the chest muscles are all which are innervated by the nerve which comes from the spinal cord. They have stopped working. They are not responding. So essentially, you need to help them to breathe. Okay. And how do you do that? Okay. So as I mentioned, the idea of using an iron lung is only that you help the patient to breathe by artificial force. Okay. So Ibsen's thinking was that the patient should be assisted in breathing by what is called as the positive pressure ventilation. The iron lung works on the normal physiological process of negative pressure, where the pressure is created by the diaphragm and the chest muscles, so that there's some kind of a vacuum created in the thoracic cavity, so that the lung sort of expands, and the person is able to take in air, and the expiration is essentially forced event in mammals. Okay. In other animals, particularly birds, etc., this process is slightly reversed. The inhalation is actually a positive event. That is, the effort is done for the inhalation, and that's one of the reasons why birds have a fairly high stamina, which means that they can fly very long distances. Okay, so of course, humans and mammals have a different physiology, and of course, Ibsen was really trying to overcome this issue. Okay. So the iron lung design by Dinkar and Shah essentially supported this normal physiological process of negative ventilation, and the machine which they had developed was sort of improvised in 1931 by another person called as Emerson. Okay, and this was made cheaper, but still the cost of this cheaper version was also fairly high for many hospitals to have in big numbers. Okay, so one of the problems in pandemics, like we have just witnessed, is there is a limitation of the medical equipment for the number of patients. Okay, and that's something which the hospitals sort of are constantly battling, how to optimize the utilization of the equipment for the number of patients they are seeing. Okay. So Ibsen had previously, the last, I think 1950-51, he had taken a small break from his routine job and had gone to the US for training. And he had learned about a technique called as bagging. And the idea of bagging was used for anesthetized patients during surgery. Okay. And in fact, in 1949, a couple of researchers, okay, Bennett is an engineer and Bauer is a emergency medicine specialist or internist at Los Angeles County Hospital. They had modified this Emerson iron lung to inflate the lung through a process called as tracheostomy. Okay, so I'll just tell you what tracheostomy in the next slide. So the idea is that in 1949, Bauer and Bennett essentially used positive pressure ventilation to essentially help patients who have difficulty or insufficient respiratory insufficiency. Okay. Okay. So tracheostomy is nothing but actually, surgically, opening is made in the trachea, and a tube is placed here, and in which something is connected like a bulb or something like that, and artificially sort of pressurized air is sort of pumped in uh, to the chest or to the lung. Okay. So the work by Bauer and Bennett was done in 1949, and they had published the findings from that work. And what they really found was that they had decreased the mortality from 80% to about 17%, which is a phenomenal decrease in the amount of case reduction or mortality reduction. But they published their work in some not so popular journal or a very obscure journal. But incidentally, Ibsen had a look at this article, and he was already looking at the significance of this work based on what he was thinking as something which is important. Just a second, I'll just come. So very quickly, let me move on to talk about the patient, Vivi Ebert. She was a 12-year-old girl. She was admitted sort of with a headache, fever, and stiff neck in August of 1952 to this hospital. And within a few hours, it was from her symptoms, it was clear that she had bulbar polio, and which essentially meant that she was heading towards death in a very short period of time. And and she was admitted to Ibsen's ward, and Ibsen was already thinking on these terms, putting her on a iron lung has very low chance of her survival, and because of the advanced state of her disease. And he talked to his bosses in the hospital that he wanted to try something different, and he met them with the paper which was published by the doctor and the engineer from Los Angeles, and he was permitted to do some experimental treatment to this girl. And so tracheostomy tube was placed in the patient, while her oxygen level, etc., blood oxygen levels, etc., were extremely low. It was going low. She was deteriorating. She had her chest filled with fluids. She was unable to breathe. So to this tracheostomy intubation tube, an oxygen-filled bag was connected, and her lung was filled. Okay, so when you try to pressurize individual like that, she was sort of reacting. She buckled or bucked a large. So to overcome this, a sedative like thiopental was given, sodium thiopental, and it is also a sedative, so which the onlookers, the other medical professionals who were sort of looking at the treatment of this particular girl at that time, they sort of felt that she is going to die. She was in such a bad condition, and top of this, this fellow is giving her a sedative, so this is essentially to speed up her death. Okay, so many of the onlookers essentially left the scene as Ibsen was sort of struggling to put oxygen into her lung. Okay, so after a few minutes, the thiopental started taking effect, and which essentially stopped the reaction of the muscles, and her gasping ceased. And this was followed by the clearance of her lung, and her condition slowly stabilized. Okay, and this situation lasted for about a couple of hours or so, maybe 5-6 hours. And after some point, the effectiveness of thiopentol sort of wore off, and she started gasping again. Okay, again the oxygen level began to come down, and the carbon dioxide levels went up, and the second dose of sedative was re-administered, and bag ventilation continued, etc. So this was a continuous sort of effort to put oxygen into her lung or chest by some kind of a mechanical, or basically, Ibsen was doing it by pumping what is called as this, football bladder kind of ball, okay, which is filled with oxygen. Okay, so this is essentially what is the field of intensive care medicine. Intensive care medicine, this is sort of the hallmark stage at which this the whole field of intensive care medicine sort of started, where the patient is continuously given some kind of support because he or she is unable to have the normal physiological processes, and some kind of external help, essentially through the physician or some other party, or nurses or somebody, or nowadays machines, to take care of some of these physiological processes, which normally the individual would normally be doing. Okay, so this was sort of the birth of the intensive care field of intensive care medicine. And just to tell you, at that time, this patient, Vivi Ebert, was continuously being pumped round the clock. And to do that, the hospital essentially recruited the services of medical students and dental students. So not only this patient, but also other patients who were having bulbar pneumonia symptoms. Okay, once she showed signs of improvement. Okay, a lot of these patients were put on this artificial, pumping of oxygen into the lungs. Okay, so a lot of these students were put on round the clock duty of pumping gas or oxygen into the chest or through the tubes. And incidentally, none of these students, fairly large number of students who are doing this day in and day out by rotation. Of course, this is a 24-hour job, so by rotation, like in shift duty, many of these students are doing just sort of pumping to help the individual to get some oxygen into their blood. Okay, so none of these students ever got caught polio. So that tells you that the polio infection did not happen through aerosols at that point of time. Okay, so at that point of time, of course, it was not known, but it was a little bit of a risky thing to put the students to do this job. But fortunately, none of these students got affected. But there were other kind of trauma felt by the medical professionals. Okay, so one of the issues was that when you do this work overnight, in the night, lights are dimmed, etc. So the students were essentially pumping air, and even when the patients died, they wouldn't know, because there was no way for them to know that whether the individual is alive or dead. Okay, so when the day broke, some of these people who died were discovered by these students, and that is really affects their morality a great deal, because you put a lot of effort and the patient doesn't survive. But the whole exercise was really successful. The mortality fell from about 87% in these polio cases to less about 10% or 11% from August to March of 1953. So in about 6 months or so, there was a drastic reduction in the mortality rate. Okay. And of course, there were other people, there were patients with other complications. They were sort of weaned away from this ventilation as once their chest muscle strength improved. But a few cases, something like about 20 out of 318 cases, this continuous requirement of this ventilation was there even for more than a year of treatment. Okay. So these cases are called as chronic respiratory patients, because they require continuous support from respirators. Okay. Also, this method of mechanical ventilation, positive pressure ventilation, improved survival from not only polio, but a lot of other cases like shock, cardiac arrest, drug overdose, etc. So nowadays it's very extensively used, and all of you probably know that even in the case of COVID, this played a very important role in many cases, right? And over a period of time, this tracheostomy, which is actually a very a harsh procedure, was replaced by putting breathing tubes through the mouth, which is called as intubation. And essentially you can do the same thing, that is you can directly through a tube and a ventilator have a positive pressure delivery of air or oxygen into the lungs of the individual. Okay, so this was sort of the development or the history of the development of the respirators and this whole field has actually developed so much that I don't need to talk more on that. Okay, so let me just move on to talk about something else, which is when you bring some radical improvement in survival, okay, there are direct effects. There are also indirect effects. There are seen effects and unseen effects. Okay. So it was fairly widely used after that, and polio seemed to have been under control. But getting back to this particular story of John Ibsen, okay, after about 20 years, 1974, he was sort of interviewed in a radio program where he was asked this question: who helps when a human being is going to pass away or who is going to die? Do we prolong the death process? Okay. And honestly, the answer which Ibsen gave at that time is that often it is much more humane to give morphine to essentially reduce the pain, peace and comfort to the patients with no hope of survival. Okay. And the interviewer asked, have you done that? And in reply, Ibsen replied that, yes, I have. It serves no purpose that no one can die without having spent at least 3 months hooked up to a respirator. Okay. So one of the consequences of putting somebody in a respirator is that, some of the people become chronic patients or chronic respirator cases, which means that continuously they need the respirator for their survival. Okay. And the question is, how long the external help needs to be given. Okay. So many times it is the doctor, the physician, and the hospital system which decides, at least in 1974, this was the case, that the physician essentially decides, what is the best scenario here. And sometimes, as Ibsen said, he has allowed patients to die because he felt their chance of survival for a long period is not very high. Unfortunately, or as it happened, following this radio interview and all his talk and discussions was broadcast around town. A lot of newspapers picked this talk, and next day the newspaper headlines read that patients beyond reach are helped to die, as though the doctor is responsible for this idea of euthanasia or forced death. And so this really created a very bad publicity for the hospital systems, and immediately Isben was suspended from hospital duties. And there were other people who were making their own points of view. And one example is some political party, Christian People's Party, for example, they called this process as murder and demanded criminal charges on this particular physician, Dr. Isben. Okay. And Copenhagen's chief medical officer, summoned Ibsen to his office to discuss about this case and this talk over the radio, etc. And Ibsen had a discussion with this chief medical officer and confirmed that he had removed dying patients from ventilator and given morphine because these patients were in extreme pain. And there were other discussions on condition situations where he had acted. And ultimately, after a long line of discussions and investigations, the chief medical officer concluded that Isben had acted reasonably, and his remarks were interpreted out of context by newspapers and the publicity machines, the media, and the whole thing became a sensitive issue, and the hospital systems were sort of brought under cloud. Okay, and subsequently, I think this idea of the ethical aspects of who decides whether the patient should live or die was sort of debated, discussed, and a lot of rules were brought in. So some of the people in the medical community actually talk about this, that there's always a conflict. Okay, active withdrawal or passive declination of any facility when the outcome, that is the phase of futility, are ethically equivalent. Okay, so whether you give a support system or when the patient is too sick to even take the support system, ethically there is no difference. Okay, that is the point of some of the doctors. And basically the statement, first statement, is to mean the second one. It's an explanation of the first statement. If someone was sick enough that you could not put them on a ventilator, if they were already not on one, then they were sick enough to be justifiably be removed from a ventilator. Okay, so the doctor is not doing something special or unusual. Okay, if the fellow had come, the patient had come with so much sickness that you wouldn't even put the fellow in a ventilator, it is the same situation as when the patient has become so deteriorated that you can remove the ventilator from that individual. Okay, so ethically there is no dilemma, but of course this can be sort of portrayed as anything one wants to. Okay, so some of the questions of ethics for all of you to think about and ponder. Okay, since many of you come from pharmaceutical colleges, pharmacy colleges, and many of you probably are working on drugs for very difficult diseases to be treated, and many of the research which you might be doing might go into patient evaluation, clinical evaluation, and some of them might even come to the market. Okay, so these are some of the questions which is of great relevance from ethics perspective. Okay, what happens if the patient cannot be weaned from a ventilator or a medicine or a drug? Okay, what is the path at that situation? Okay, what happens if physically the body recovers from some kind of a treatment, but not mentally? Okay, what do we do with such individuals or in such cases? Should intensive care be offered to everybody? Okay, and this is particularly a very important question in countries where social medicine is quite rampant, like Denmark or United Kingdom. In our country, we don't really have this problem because only people who can afford medicines, they get treated like this. Majority of our population, they cannot simply afford very state of the art or very advanced treatments in many cases, and which is really one of the ethically disturbing question to answer. So even in countries like US, where it is not, there's a lot of advanced technologies are available, many of these treatments essentially are linked to insurance payment. And so insurance companies are very much interested in having clear-cut and most importantly, profitable decisions. Okay. And lastly, does life support benefits all patients? Okay, some patients, it might support, can we know in advance that, how quickly a patient might recover, or in some cases, the patient may not even respond. So in many cases, even in cases like, bulbar pneumonia, as I mentioned, not all patients respond positively to life support systems. Okay. So I'll just close this story before I get on to talk a little bit more about the ethical aspects of, as far as the patient Vivi Ebert was concerned. Okay, she required continuous mechanical ventilation till 1953, almost 3 years or 2.5 years, and she was discharged from Blackdam Hospital in 1959. Okay, so 6 more years she stayed in the hospital, but without intensive care. But still, every night, she was to be on a ventilator under medical supervision. Okay, and she, at the age of 12, she had gone to the hospital with the symptoms, but she survived for about 20 more years up to that point. She completed her education from a wheelchair. She couldn't move around, but she could type, etc., and paint. And she lived for about 20 years. And she died at the age of about 31. Okay. So she was a very lovely individual. A lot of her friends and relatives liked her and wanted her to have as normal a life as possible. But all said and done, she did not have a normal life. She was physically handicapped. She required continuous support for taking care of her daily activities. And incidentally, she died at the age of 31. Okay. Okay, so the last segment, which will take about 10 minutes or so, let me just bring out some of these other aspects of medical developments. Okay, So the field of intensive care medicine, as I told you, that it was really born when this aspect of how to do positive pressure ventilation. And in 1970, in the United States, the Society of Intensive Care Medicine was born or formed. And now it is sort of recognized as a specialty, a special discipline in the field of medicine. And some medical professionals specialize in intensive care medicines. Okay. And there's been a lot of progress, of course. Okay. Incidentally, with the development of intensive care medicine, this area of chronic critical illness also sort of came into existence. Before intensive care treatment or critical care treatment, there was no concept of chronic critical care illness. Okay. So critical care illness is sort of a consequence of the development of the intensive care line or medicine, the field of intensive care medicine. Okay. About 5 to 10% of all respiratory failure patients, even today, end up in ventilator rehab facilities. Okay, they don't completely recover. They require a lot of physiotherapy and help to get their muscles strong and work, etc. Okay. And about 50% of these patients die within about a year, okay, which means that about 50% of the patients live for more than a year. And about 10% of the people who go for this intensive care, about 10%, they are not, they have a lot of requirements. Okay, they are unable to walk. Well, only less than about 10% are able to walk, eat, dress independently, etc. So about 40% of these patients require other kind of assistance on a regular basis for their day-to-day job. Okay, so one might question, what is the value of their life, and it's not something which can be answered very glibly or very easily. Okay. So this is one of the questions is the medical field, and particularly intensive care medical field, routinely faces. Okay. So talking about pandemics and progress and challenges in innovations, let me touch on some of the points. Okay. So after about 70 years of that incident, okay, a lot of progress has happened in polio virus, decoding polio virus mysteries. Okay, we have learned quite a bit about polio virus, and notably, vaccines were developed, and these people sort of, Salk got the Nobel Prize for his work. The Salk and Sedim vaccines were introduced in 55 and 61. And which has almost globally eradicated polio. Okay, so most of you may not know any individuals who are affected by polio at this point of time, except for some older generation people. Okay, and but still there are a few pockets, and particularly number of cases, say in the hundreds or 200s essentially are reported from some region in Afghanistan, Pakistan area, in spite of the availability of very good vaccines. And to some extent, there have been reports about the social or the political turbulence in some of these areas are really the reasons why it's not been possible to completely eradicate this particular disease. Okay, all of you probably know that we have eradicated smallpox several decades back now, and it is possible that polio should be eradicated, but it's not been eradicated for for some reasons. Okay, there are many reasons, but the bottom line is, unfortunately, in some part of the world, people are still affected by polio, in spite of the availability of vaccines, etc. And talking about vaccines, there's another thing which all of you probably have come across, that in the recent news, that in a lot of countries, there's a lot of what are called as anti-vaxxers, or people who don't believe in taking vaccines, particularly for COVID, and that not only affects those individuals but also keeps the disease in the society, or in the population. Okay. One of the aspects of epidemics and pandemics is that they force the display of strength and weakness in the political order of the infected or infested societies. This was a statement made by medical historian Wackers. Okay, and you can see that in the case of COVID, some countries have done much better than other countries, and it has a lot to do with the political willingness of different countries about how to manage epidemics. Okay, and lastly, out of disasters and plagues, emerge new life-saving tactics or developments which are predicated on applied science and engineering, and mostly these are practiced in real time. That is, when the disease is there, some people have the guts to do the experiments on those in those challenging situations, and major developments have happened. Okay, so one of the things which I can tell as a consequence of COVID pandemic is that these RNA-based vaccines have sort of become possible and implementable not only for COVID but also for a lot of other diseases, which has now been proved by a lot of data all over the world that technology has sort of crossed the bottleneck of effectiveness. Okay, so the idea of RNA-based vaccines is not a new one. It's been around for almost about 30 years or so, but there were a lot of challenges of small things. And one of the positive things one can say about this pandemic is that at least it proved that it is possible to develop RNA-based vaccines and in a very short period of time, and can potentially save the life of a lot of people in a very short period of time. Okay, so advances in the field of healthcare medicine, oftentimes they trade one problem in the present for another in the future. Okay, as in this case of the ventilators, it certainly helped the patients who are affected, who had respiratory failure, but another problem was sort of opened up, which is the chronic respirator cases. Okay, certainly a lot more patients or a lot more people benefited, but always there is a small segment or small group who don't enjoy the benefit of some of these innovations. Okay. Incidentally, intensive care medicine was extremely successful, but it also became a victim of its own success. Okay, so some of these ethical questions have been blown up, and there's been a lot of discussions, and consequently, a lot of reforms have been done based on bioethical policies. And one of the major reforms is that the role of physicians have been sort of as a decider or arbiter of the ventilator switch or life and death switches. That has been changed, and the current thinking is that this kind of a decision is to be essentially left to the the patient or somebody who is associated with the patient, surrogate or the second in line to the patient, for example. So the autonomy of this decision making essentially has gone from the doctors to the patient or the next in the circle of the patient, his spouse or parent or whoever that might be. Okay. But the problem in this is, of course, this that the decision is not a very clear cut, yes or no, or turning on or off a switch, whether it is to put the ventilator on, or whether it is to give a medicine, or whether it is to give an injection, or whether it is to do a surgery or whatever it is. Okay, the nuance and complexity of this question of medicine and intensive care related problems, the problem is they challenge the expectation that laypersons can make dispassionate and informed decisions. Okay, when you give this authority of decision making to laypersons, one hopes that the decision is made without without passion getting into the way, based on information. But rarely, when we talk about laypersons, they are not really trained to look at all the ramifications, the information which is available, which is useful, which is not useful, etc. Okay. So to make any decisions, autonomous decisions, or decisions which are not influenced by things like market forces or hospital administrations or the bias of the doctors, etc. Okay. If for making autonomous decisions, you require really two things. One is you require the freedom to make your own decisions. You are not forced to make some decisions. And the second is that you have the tools to make the informed decisions. Okay. So decision making is quite simple in a very abstract situation, but in real life situations, it's very difficult to make decisions. Okay. So what the medical field and the implementation of ethical principles have done is that we have given the freedom, or we have removed the freedom from the physician and given it to the patient or the surrogate of the patient. So there are a lot of procedures now which sort of force the hospital management to seek the inputs from its customers, whether they are the patients themselves or the next in kith or line of the patient. So on the freedom part, a lot has been done, but not on the tools part. Okay. So for example, what aspects of tools we have not actually made progress. Okay. One is on the education, to put the options in context. Okay. When somebody has to take some decisions, okay, so the individual requires some kind of an education, which means some kind of awareness to the situation and who is knowledgeable, etc. It's not necessarily somebody has to have a degree or something like that, but he or she is able to look at the context and make decisions. Okay. And the other is that a lot of options might be available, but the thing is that some options are sort of truly limiting, and limiting the options to that may be truly be providing benefit. Okay, giving all kind of options is not useful. One has to say, if you go through this option, there is a 95% chance of benefit. If you go through this this option, there might be only a 50% chance of benefit. Okay, and when we talk about benefit, there are many aspects of benefit, so it's very difficult to quantify that also. For example, I know some cases, and I'm sure many of you know cases that towards the end of life, people have spent a good part of their savings into hospital bills and eventually succumbing to their diseases. Okay. And many times this leaves the family asking these questions, was that kind of an expense really helpful in helping those individuals? Okay. And lastly, what are the values of the patient? How any kind of treatment or option is going to be in alignment with the patient's value. Okay. And particularly if the patient is comatose or unable to have a normal awareness to say what are the values, it'll be very, very difficult. Okay. And I'm sure, many of you have had this situation where the concerned people's values might be in conflict with the kind of process they are going through. Okay. So these are areas where I think, the tools are not adequately available and to help make proper, ethically valuable and meaningful decisions. Okay. So lastly, I will just stop this by saying that, the lesson from Ibsen's effort or discovery or research is that it resulted in the development of modern ventilators. And actually, it does not matter what is the source of patient's gasping. Okay. When patient is gasping, essentially you need to provide air or oxygen to his lung. You simply have to bring his breathing back in order. Okay. So this is sort of the simplest thing, which there is no controversy on this statement. Okay. But some of the other things I talked about are much more difficult to answer. Okay. Okay. So I'll stop here, and if there are any comments or questions, I know we can.
Sir, this is Ramnathan.
Yes.
So during that period, I don't think so they would have any strong ethical committee or ethical clearance. And
Correct.
when the patients, their prime aim is to what's the treatment and see that the patient is comfortable and discharged after the recovery.
Correct.
So why those points not been highlighted? And there is you said some link is there been, the doctor has been brought into a, what to say, improper treatment, those things, unethical aspects and all. Is there any religion or with ethics, sir?
Okay. So let me just go back and say that this particular case which I talked about started in 1952. Okay. The patient came to his hospital in 1952, and within about 2-3 days, whatever he was thinking in terms of the way to treat, which was sort of radical at that point of time, his hospital committee permitted him to do that work because the prognosis of that individual was extremely bad. Okay. And within about a week's time, 3-4 days time, they were able to see positive benefit, which meant that more patients were, more patients got the benefit of this kind of treatment. That is a positive pressure ventilation. That is basically you put a hole in the neck and start pumping oxygen through a bulb or something like that. Okay. And the machine nowadays, what we call as ventilator machines, all the mechanical aspects of pumps and controls, etc. They happened over many several years. It's not immediately that happened, but it happened, developed over a period of time. The question you are asking is, in 1950, there was no idea of asking the patient whether this kind of a treatment you want to undergo or not. Okay. So the whole problem came when this doctor was interviewed in some radio program about a sort of a hypothetical situation. saying that, when you have a situation when, patient is not going to survive, what do you do? Okay. And he gave a honest answer that, in his judgment, if he felt that the patient, if the patient is actually suffering, that is, he is having a lot of pain, and in his judgment, the patient is not going to improve, etc. He would rather give, pain-killing medicines, and remove ventilator from him. Okay. And so the question which was asked to him in the radio program was, have you done that? And he said, yes, I have given morphine to cases where, I don't see any, good
improvement
progress.
or any betterment. Yeah.
Right. And this whole idea, this happened in 1970, 74 or something like that, almost about 20 years after that. Okay. So even at that point of time, the hospital systems were essentially deciding everything. Okay. But since this conversation was put in the radio, and a lot of people listened to it and then followed the very next day in newspapers, etc. At that time, the idea of euthanasia was being discussed, etc. There was no clear-cut idea, whether euthanasia should be given or not, etc. Okay, who decides, etc. And here was a doctor who was saying that, I decided on behalf of the patient that I will stop the life support system. Okay. And this was sort of painted by the media that, this fellow deliberately killed that individual. Okay. And there were also, that there are all kind of people. So there was a political party which said that, this is murder, and they have to put a, criminal case against him, etc., etc. Okay. And he was immediately stopped from, going to the clinic. Okay. His hospital or the administration in Copenhagen stopped it from doing that. Okay. Then there was some inquiry, etc. And ultimately, the chief medical officer essentially gave a press conference saying that, okay, whatever he said, whatever the dialogue was reported out of context, and something was made to appear that the hospitals are there to kill people. Okay, so it was really not the case, and the whole allegations against him were sort of dropped, and he was allowed to go and practice medicine subsequently. There was no issues. But this incident essentially started this debate about the ethics of who decides, and subsequently this idea of who is to decide the fate of an individual. So at that time, and subsequently at that point of time, the decision was that the doctors will not decide, the hospital will not decide, it will be the patient or some surrogate of the patient. Okay. So right now, that's what happens even now in not only in Copenhagen but all over the world. Right. So the ethical questions, essential. So the problem with that is that the patient or the patient's husband or wife, they are not medically trained or something like that, but they have to take decisions about life and death. Okay. And they may not be able to say, okay, giving this treatment in 3 months' time will improve the patient or not. Okay. So yeah, doctor who goes after 10, 15, 20 years of training and education still will not be able to do, but he'll be probably in a better position to decide than somebody who has who is purely reacting from a sort of non-medical or non-information based decision. Okay, purely from their attachment or something like that. Okay, so that's basically the issue.
Okay, thank you, sir.
Right. So maybe I have
Yeah.
the whole issue, but I think this is an important issue not only in research but also in clinical practice or medical practice.
But even nowadays, even with the honor killing or euthanasia, it's very tough unless otherwise the court directs with the committee members. Nobody wants to take up the liability, even the doctors.
Correct.
So even removing of the life-saving system, even at the last minute, even the patient the doctor knows, that attendant knows that he is going to not survive. Still, the decision is not been taken. It's a very tough call, sir.
Right. And, there's another aspect to it that, say, for example, in India, for example, okay, if you are from sort of a middle class or upper middle class family and you live to a long age, the chances of you are getting into some kind of medical situation towards the end of your life is fairly high. Okay. And many a times in many families, I have heard, and I have also seen in some of my close families also, that more than necessary, exposure to the hospital system is done. And ultimately, the consequence is that the fellow or the individual dies in a relatively short period of time. And so this aspect of the medical treatment is basically that, you do palliative treatment. Okay, this idea of palliative treatment has become only, I wouldn't say it has become popular, but it's now only you listen about it, hear about it, that in some situations, and this will happen probably in some educated families or something like that, that they go for what is called as palliative treatment, which is, you don't necessarily give the individual very harsh drugs or medical treatments. You allow the individual to you take care of their suffering, whether it is pain or psychological suffering or something like that, to the extent possible that mentally they are not upset. Okay.
Yeah.
Right.
Yes, sir. Now it's becoming popular, sir. Palliative.
Right.
So it is gaining popularity.
Right.
Okay. So thank you, sir. Over to MC.
Are there any questions or any doubts or anything like that?
Yeah. So any questions are there? You can ask delegates. So you're not audible, Ma Deepthi. No, you're not audible.
Sir, can you hear me, sir, now?
Yeah.
Dear delegates, if you have any questions, you can type it in the chat box, or you can unmute and ask directly to sir.
Hello.
Yes.
Yes, sir, you can talk. We can hear you. Hello, sir. Thank you so much for your informative session, sir. We would like to hear more from you, sir. Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you for the opportunity. I hope the program goes well. All the participants benefit from the various experts, and hopefully we begin to see more research outputs from the various colleges in the field of pharmacy education and research. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you, sir. Thanks for your time and spending time with us. It's wonderful. We learned a lot, and also the invention of ventilator. Really interesting. Thanks a lot, sir.
Since I am now in a biomedical engineering department, I thought I shouldn't let the department lose. So I was talking about discovery of.
So don't look for gasping. Yeah, that's a good one, sir. Don't look for gasping. Bring down the thing. That's the take-home message.
Right. And nowadays, in the last 2 years, all of us have heard about ventilators and other things.
Yes, sir. Right. Thank you, sir.
Okay. Bye. All the best.
Thank you, sir. Thanks a lot.
Dear delegates, let's end up today's morning session, and we will join back at 1:45 for the next session. The next session will start at 2 p.m. Thank you so much for your cooperation.